Now, we have our next special guest. Happy Veterans Day to everyone. Here in the studio, we have Colonel Dane Harden. Good morning, Colonel.
Good morning.
Now, you've been busy this morning.
I have been. I've been running all over the Southwest Virginia region here.
You're in high demand a lot of the time, but especially this time of year.
Yeah, I often get asked to do talks and things like that about Veterans Day and about the meaning of service and those sorts of things. I suspect it goes along with the retank, even though I'm retired, that sometimes when you're an old colonel, people seek you out.
You're in uniform today. Thank
Yes,
you. It's an honor to have you here. We want to thank you for your service and for your continuing focus on really giving back to the community, because not only are you speaking and motivating people about the service that you've done for our country, but you're also a black belt in martial arts. You have all sorts of different things that we're going to be talking about this morning. Talk to me a little bit about your background in the Army.
Well, how many hours do we have?
Okay, we got about 45 minutes, but you can come back.
I enlisted on a delayed entry program back in 1975 when I was a senior in high school, and it was the only time that a recruiter probably ever told somebody the absolute truth. He told me that if I enlisted at that time, I would get the Vietnam-era veterans benefits, and those things changed in December of 75. So I enlisted in December of 75. Graduated from high school in June of 76 and went off to basic training, Fort Leonard Wood, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and was a buck private, E1, and a combat engineer, and learned how to blow things up.
Now, as a child, did you know that you wanted to serve our country? Was this the career that you envisioned yourself doing when you were younger?
Honestly, pretty much. I came from a military family. My brother David retired from the 101st Airborne. He was a master sergeant. My dad was a staff sergeant and served in Okinawa in World War II. My grandfather served in World War I. I have a great-grandfather whose Grand Army, the Republic certificate is hanging on my wall. He was a private in the Union Army. And even going back to the Revolutionary War, one of our first ancestors was a officer in Washington's military. So I guess it's in my blood.
In your blood. I would think that would be an advantage. I have a couple friends and their spouses are currently serving, and one of them said to me one day, she said, I knew that I never wanted to marry somebody who was in the service because of the sacrifice. And then she ended up falling in love. And now it's a lifestyle for them. And she's honored to be part of that. But I'm sure growing up in a military family, you knew the passion, the honor, the sacrifice. And I would say that would, in a lot of ways, I get chills as I'm talking, a lot of ways that probably set your career up in a different way than some people who enlist and maybe don't really realize what it entails.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, my father wasn't a professional guy. He served for his 4 years and got out. But my brother Dave was in for more than 20, so of course there was that influence. But yeah, I mean, it's they used to say that they don't issue you a wife; you have to find one. And luckily, I've been married for 30 plus years, and my wife Sherry. Her father worked for one of the intelligence agencies. I won't say which alphabet agency he worked for, but they were constantly moving around and overseas. So she was kind of custom tailored for me, I think.
Good. Yeah, it was a divine connection. Now, I know based on certain things that there are topics that we can discuss and that we can't discuss, but what are some of the things that our listeners might not be aware of that you experienced during your time as you served our country?
Just
pick some stuff that you think would be interesting.
I mean, I served in when I first commissioned. I went in as an enlisted guy. I earned the ranks from private through sergeant, and then got out. And then the reason I did that was because there was no money to go to college. My dad, worked in a factory, and there wasn't that much money because my 3 older brothers and sisters were all in college at the same time. And I remember when I asked my father about, is there any cash around that I could try to go on to school, because I didn't have scholarship back then so much. He said, well, not really, son. So I went in the Army, and that's the reason for the GI Bill, and that allowed me to earn degrees in biology and respiratory therapy and a master's degree and then another master's degree. And then I went off to med school at Essex, which was a Hopkins affiliate program. I went through physician assistant training and graduated from there in 91, and then I direct commissioned as a second lieutenant. So that it's kind of a circuitous path, but all of it really was because of the military influence and the opportunities from the GI Bill and from the Veterans Administration.
When you got here in the studio this morning, we set you up with a headset and microphone, and I mean, we were, kind of just doing our thing. And Rick said, now, if you hear a voice in the headphones, and of course, there's like a background music, and then sometimes it's Rick's voice, and there's a lot going on in the set of headphones. And you said, I'm just talking to Kristi, and you said you're right at home.
I was actually a flight surgeon. They opened up flight surgeon training to PAs in 1995 or 6. And I went to one of the very first flight surgeon training programs. There were 3 mid-level providers, physician assistants, all 3 of us, and most of them had special forces backgrounds, and then several MDs. Very challenging course, but the flight surgeon school's at Fort Rucker, Alabama. We do a lot of boring stuff from the standpoint of flight physicals and giving up slips and taking care of aviators, making sure they're fit to fly and those sorts of things. But then also there's the other 50% of it, which is trauma medevac. I flew trauma medevac missions in Bosnia during the Balkans War, Kosovo near Camp Bondsteel, 2 tours in Iraq during OIF 2 and then again in OIF 4. Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then also Bagram Air Base up at Afghanistan through LREs, long-range evacs. Did a rescue mission, search and rescue at Hurricane Katrina. Just lots of stuff. My last rotation overseas was 2016. I was in Romania and Bulgaria, which is actually a pretty cool rotation. The guy that was the commander there in Romania was a major, and so I showed up as a full-bird colonel, and they just didn't know what to do with me. So I said, well, when I'm done in clinics, can I go into town, into Chinku, and get dinner? And so it actually worked out great because they would send, I guess, 4 or 5 MPs with me as my personal security detail.
Nice.
And the MPs loved it, so we would go in and eat steaks on the economy. It was awesome.
When we set up this interview, I asked you to send a couple pictures.
Sure.
And there was one picture with Chuck Norris. I put it up on my public Facebook page, and we've been linking it and things like that. When did you meet Chuck Norris, and what does that picture stand for?
Well, that picture's actually kind of a sad one. Mr. Norris and I were at my teacher's funeral. Jun Rhee, Grandmaster Jun Rhee, was the father of Taekwondo in the United States. He's the guy that actually brought Taekwondo to the U.S. back in the 1950s, originally to Texas. I was one of his black belts. I have a 8th dan, a Hachidan in Taekwondo. I've been training since 1969 in several martial arts halls of fame. I have a Yandan, a 4th dan in Aikido. I have a black belt in the samurai sword as well. Trained from Dana Abbott, who's a black belt Hall of Famer. My Aikido instructor, Kevin Block, is also a black belt Hall of Famer. Jun Rhee, he's like a legend in the martial arts. And that really has been something that I've had since I was about 9 or 10 years old. That's kind of been a discipline in my life that's really, really, really helped.
So I want to talk about the school
Sure.
and things here when we get back. We need to take a quick commercial break. Can you stay with us?
Absolutely.
Would it be okay if we open up the phone lines if people have some questions?
Not a problem.
Okay, good. We're just going to put you through the ringer today.
Okay, well, it wouldn't be the first time. No.
Yeah, this is nothing. After
easier.
everything you've done, it's so easy. You can probably do it while you're asleep. Okay, the number, if you'd like to call and join in the conversation, is 1-800-469-0098. Again, that's 1-800-469-0098. This is your host, Kristi Slaughter, on SuperTalk 92.9. We'll be back here in just a moment. Welcome back. This is your host, Kristi Slaughter, on SuperTalk Saturday mornings, WFHG. Thank you for listening today. Special thank you to all of our veterans out there. We're going to be talking about Veterans Day here again in a few minutes. I'm joined with my special guest, Colonel Dane Harden. He's had a busy morning here in Southwest Virginia, attended a Veterans Day breakfast this morning, and been speaking all over our region. During the commercial break, we talked about all of the extensive background you've had in multiple forms of martial arts. I had mentioned the picture with Chuck Norris before the commercial break, and you said that maybe your love of martial arts started around the age of 9. And I'm wondering, from a standpoint of being a teacher, you also have a school, Western Masters Martial Arts.
That's
in
correct.
Abingdon. You have multiple locations. What kind of impact have you personally seen that martial arts has on people when they take up this unique type of discipline?
Oh, I think it's huge. It can be truly life-changing. I mean, there's something in martial systems that is called the Budo mindset, and Budo is this path of the warrior, and there are the 5 minds. The first mind is called Shoshin, which is the idea of a beginner's mind, which teaches a student to always approach something with an empty cup, to be fresh on the subject, to be that new student in the class that's just really want to learn. You're hungry for the knowledge, and if you can do that every day, that invokes this third mind, the Fudoshin, the mind of the continuous master, the guy who always wants to learn. And I always tell my students I'm a teacher, but I'm not a master, because a master is someone who, in essence, should really know every in and out and every nuance of the martial art. And there are so many different styles of martial arts. I trained from Joe Louis, who was a world champion kickboxer and pretty much a martial art legend. He was Bruce Lee's training partner. I trained with Joe for many years. And so my niche is more stand-up kickboxing, things along that line. Aikido is close quarters combat. I helped with some of the development of the Army's CDT program, which is a combat defensive tactics program. My weakness would probably be going to ground. So if the jiu-jitsu guys get me to the ground, then they'll choke me out, and that'll be that. But I've done some co-training with Renzo Gracie, and he gave me a great compliment. He said, "Well, they're going to have to get past those kicks first."
I've watched some YouTube videos. This is just something that we haven't talked about much, but occasionally I'll get in the mode of watching different martial arts YouTube videos and different styles and comparing them. And there was this one program where they had some men from the military come in, and I remember one of the instructors, one specific guy, he was great. He had great kicks, but his instructor kept saying, "Don't get to the ground. Do not allow yourself," because then it would be over. Yeah,
I mean, that's you need to have a blending of styles, a blending of systems, and of course through the military we do some ground fighting and top mounts and side mounts and things like that, joint locks, and you can certainly apply it if you go to ground. But the classic saying is that all fights go to ground, which is what ground fighters say, and I agree with that 100%. If they'll agree with me 100% that all fights start standing up, and they do.
Just be fast and keep staying. I don't even know. I'm giving advice on that thing. I know.
First.
Yeah, I was a dance major, so. But I've had experience to go to different places and take some introductory courses and things, and I was surprised at how much dance crosses over with a lot of those types of things.
Lewis used to say, if you watch someone who's a good dancer, Sensei Lewis, that they're going to make a good fighter, because especially if you're a stand-up fighter, you have to have mobility, you have to have maneuver, you have to have timing and rhythm. Sometimes you can use your footwork to create something called deceptive penetration versus broken timing and broken rhythm, where they think an attack is coming at a certain point, and that millisecond of delay creates an opening, and then you fill the space.
You talked a little bit about how martial arts has really molded and helped to give you, I would think, an edge, a benefit in your military career. But talk to me a little bit more about how that has crossed over, because that really, your love of martial arts became very early in your career before you actually went into the military. So if we have parents, grandparents, or people in the community that are thinking, I don't know if the student should be involved in martial arts, how has that helped to mold and shape what you've done with your professional career in the military?
Well, I guess a classic example, after flight surgeon training, this is an example of why you don't volunteer. After flight surgeon school, they had a program called SEER training, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. And they had 5 seats for that school at Camp Blanding, Florida. And they said if any of the Guard guys are interested, and I was a National Guardsman at that time, they said if any of the Guard guys are interested, we're more than welcome to put you on orders. And I thought, well, you know what, that would be cool. So I raised my hand. And then for the next 3 weeks, I'm going through SEER training, and it was pretty challenging stuff. But the one thing that is interesting is at one point we got captured. Everybody gets captured. You get put in a hostage situation. And, of course, your wrists are tied, and your knees are tied, and your elbows are tied, and your ankles are tied, and they have you sitting on your knees, which for most people is very uncomfortable. But in martial art, we refer to that position as seiza, and I can sit there all day. Which is exactly pretty much what I did. And I closed my eyes, went to a happy place through some mindless meditation. And at the end of it, we were doing our evasion portion, and me and a guy named Tim Vivian. Tim was a Green Beret, and I was the flight surgeon candidate, and we were all out there running around, and we got caught by 4 of the instructors. And they said, any of you martial arts guys, if you think you know what you're doing, go ahead and try it out. But it's never worked in the 20 years they've run the course. Well, the guy made the mistake of grabbing me by the wrist, and in that one scenario, it worked perfectly. So I slung these guys around, and me and Tim Vivian took off running. And at the end of the school, the one instructor walked up to me and said, "You know what?" He said, "Captain, you're the real deal." And so that
and a
kind
compliment
of made me
like
proud.
that. Oh, yes, that was it. Solidified the rest of your life being
Yes, ma'am.
passionate about martial arts and what you do. In your school in Abingdon, you have several different styles of martial arts that really aren't found here in our area. I remember coming across your website several years ago looking for different styles of martial arts. Talk to us about what people can find there.
Well, obviously we teach Taekwondo, which is a very common martial art. That's a Master Ree used to refer to it as Korean karate. And the reason he called it that back in the 50s and 60s is because everybody at that time knew about Japanese karate do, but they didn't know about Taekwondo. And in fact, Taekwondo wasn't even a name at that time. It was something that was assigned later. So that's the common style that we teach. But then we also teach a system called Yoshinkan Aikido, which traces its lineage to Daito-Ryu Aiki Jiu-Jitsu. So we do have a lineage with the Jiu-Jitsu guys. And the Daito-Ryu is a style that was taught to a gentleman named Morihei Ueshiba, who was the founder of Aikido. And I really was drawn back to Aikido. That was the first style that I studied back in the 60s, and I was drawn back to it in 2001 after I'd gotten back from Bosnia. And it was because it was an art of peace. And Ueshiba Sensei had lived through World War II, where he lived in Iwama, was not so far from Nagasaki and the A-bomb and those sorts of things. So just great styles. We also teach Goshindo Bato Do, which is a classical samurai sword system. I train under a gentleman named Dana Abbott. Our senior instructor is a gentleman named Tetsundo Tanabe, who was a 10th Dan. He's recently passed away as well.
You selected your name very early on. What year did you come up with the name for your school?
I'd been in martial arts about 10 years. The name is Western Masters because at that time it was rather rare to have a martial system that was primarily being run by somebody who was a Gaijin, who was not Oriental. I had trained directly from Master Ree, and of course he was Korean. And in my Japanese system, the head of our Aikido program, Gozo Shioda, so these were all Orientals. Westerners didn't teach at that time. So I thought if I'm a Westerner, I wanted to try to reflect what it is that I'm being taught by Easterners.
We need to take a quick commercial
Sure.
break and do a little bit of news. Can you stay with us?
Oh, sure.
Okay. You also work for the VA. Rick, this man is very, very busy. You thought you were busy. Makes me not want to complain. I know. We are going to open up the phone lines if anyone has any questions. It's 1-800-469-0098. Again, that's 1-800-469-0098. We'll be back here in just a few minutes. We're back with my special guest, Colonel Dane Harden. We've been discussing your background in the military, Veterans Day. We want to thank you for what you're doing. You are currently working for the VA. You're doing so many different things for the veterans in our area. So we'd like to thank you, and we honor you and the other veterans.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you.
You mentioned MedVac, and I'm wondering about some of the military advances and technology since you initially started and how those are being incorporated.
Oh, wow. Well, unfortunately, a lot of times medical advances go on steroids whenever you're talking about in a combat setting. Some of the things that you see on trauma medevacs are things that a civilian doctor would probably never, ever see in their entire lifetime. So it gets interesting. And particularly as I'm a PA, as far as my medical training in the civilian world goes, and the flight surgeon slice added in the trauma evac things. Let's see. We used to, when I was in Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, we were experimenting with a British med that was called polymerized hemoglobin. And that is a version of hemoglobin that, because we would use different blood products in order to replace blood loss. Shock and trauma are what we're trying to combat. And polymerized hemoglobin is a powder that you could add saline to, mix it, and then you could put it into an IV solution. And it actually had the ability to carry oxygen and improve oxygen delivery capacity to the tissues so that it reduced the possibility of stroke greatly. The problem with young soldiers is they're usually very fit, extremely fit, and so they do well until they don't. And it's usually they dump on you, and they go from appearing to be fairly stable to being in full-blown shock, in 30 to 40 seconds if you don't replace fluid volume. So some of the things that we've really advanced, like body armor, that's now the Kevlar's on the sides versus we had a guy who got shot. It was a through-and-through wound that dropped both lungs, nicked the back of his heart. Of course, there's not much you can do about that. Polymerized hemoglobin, of course, I've already mentioned. There's quick clot. Quick clot is something that's made from actually volcanic pumice. So it's what's called an adsorbent. It'll actually pull out the serum and hemoconcentrates the formed element so that the platelets will speed up the clot formation. Surgeons don't particularly like it when you use quick clot because they've got to clean out the wound, and it can be some problems. So that led to advances in dressings and bandages, and so now we have bandages that are called chitosan bandages, which come from the shell of kind of like the same species of fish as like a shrimp. And so that actually helps to speed up clotting and those sorts of things. We've come up with the Israeli bandages, which have the same kind of an idea. Currently, we issue all soldiers a tourniquet that is a tourniquet where you can spin the windlass, which is the stick that you crank it down, but it's a one-handed tourniquet because if you have your hand blown off, how are you going to put a tourniquet if it's a two-handed tourniquet? So, the technology and the things that you see are really pretty interesting. I did an evac, and the guys from Landstuhl Regional Medical Center were literally in my helmet, in my ear tag. We had a camera that was attached to the helmet that could see what was going on whenever we were doing our primary clearance, and they were asking questions while I'm 1,000 miles away in the middle of Iraq doing evac things, and I'm listening to the students ask questions. I particularly remember one time I heard a student in the background say, "I think he broke his sterile field." I felt like reaching through the helmet and smacking him. You try to remain sterile in this environment. But yeah, it's really an interesting thing.
When we were talking about your connection with martial arts and the focus, being able to be present, being able to be still in the midst of chaos. As you're describing this, and I'm getting the mental picture the best that I can. Wasn't in the military. I don't come from a military family, but from what I can conceptualize in my own mind, being able to find yourself in a situation like that and being able to really think in the drop of a hat, or even just go into help mode, going into healing mode. But I'm wondering how much thought is really coming in, or do you just find yourself in that situation, going back on your knowledge, your research, what you've done, your experience, because I'm sure every case is different. You're not really going to know what you get until you're presented with it. Talk to me a little bit about that dynamic.
Okay. Well, I wrote an article for Black Belt Magazine that was called "The Way You Fight is Because of the Way You Train, and the way you train will determine how you fight." And in the military, of course, you train. I'd taken the Air Force trauma surgery course, combat tactical casualty care courses, just advanced trauma life support courses, and all of those things. And you constantly train. And through training, you develop automaticity. So just like if you're a soldier and you have a stoppage in your M16, you're taught to perform sports, slap, pull, observe, release, tap, squeeze. And it should flow like that. It shouldn't be something that you have to pause and think about. It should be automatic. And a lot of the things that we do in a trauma setting, rapid sequence intubation, putting in chest tubes, doing Crike tubes into a throat, trying to decompress a wound that's bleeding pretty severely, putting on a tourniquet, dumping in IV fluids. A lot of the technology that we talk about in the military, we were using hetastarch at one point. Hetastarch is 500 cc's, has a volume expansion that's 4 times that of normal IV solution. The civilian doctor would say, well, why on earth would you bother doing that? Well, if you've got to carry 4 liters of IV fluid versus 2 bags of hetastarch at 500 cc's, which is only 1,000 cc's, there's a weight issue, particularly in Iraq where it's 100, 110, 115 degrees. And if you're on a medevac on a flight line and you've got the reflective heat from the airfield, it can be 120, 125 degrees inside of the fuselage of the aircraft.
Incredible.
Thank you, ma'am.
Before I let you go today, because I know you're super busy, you've had a hectic morning being in our community and celebrating Veterans Day, are there things that you'd like to share with our listeners before we let you go today?
I would just, a lot of people ask about what do you say to a veteran on Veterans Day, and I would just say the best thing that you could tell a veteran is thank you for your service, and I think that pretty well sums it up.
Well, thank you for your service, and thank you for continuing to give back to our community in multiple ways. It's an honor to have you here. We'd love to have you back on anytime.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it so much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be back here in just a few minutes. This is your host, Kristi Slaughter, on SuperTalk Saturday mornings.